manufactured today because there's a Formula One meeting, I believe, at 4 p.m. Bernie has sent the text out. SMS has been sent.
Yeah, Anthony, it's a must attend.
It has?
Still fancy.
Anthony, exciting times in Formula One, but also
Indeed.
Challenging times
Indeed.
as well.
Indeed. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, David, and thank you, Graeme, and thank you, Paul. My first question is going to go to Graeme, but just for everybody's benefit, I'm going to ask you very shortly to put your hands together because last year, Manor was one of 2 teams that went into administration, or Chapter 11, but thanks to Jules Bianchi and thanks to the vision of Stephen Fitzpatrick, the new owner of Manor, Manor came out and was the only team ever in the history of Formula One to come out successfully of Chapter 11. So that deserves a round of applause.
I have to say, I've never ever had a round of applause for bringing a company out of administration, well, but it is important.
Yes, well, it's important for the sport. And I guess my question to you, firstly, is obviously it must have been a very tough time with what happened with the previous owner, Chili Chilton and Andre. But equally, when Stephen came in with his vision, and in terms of the employee engagement, picking yourself up from that, my question is, how do you then bounce back and profile the type of values and principles that you have as a team and try and match those with sponsors, and how do you engage with sponsors?
Well, it's difficult, you know. Formula One teams are large companies now. We employ a lot of people. We have a responsibility to those people and their families, and also we have a responsibility to the supply chain, and the supply chain in Formula One is enormous. If you look at the numbers and the logistics of Pirelli, who supply all the teams, you know, it's mind-blowing. So we, as directors of the company, we have you know, very clear responsibilities to quite a wide audience, but also as a team, we you know, we had some tragedy last year, and there's no other way of putting it. And so for all of the staff in particular, there was an emotional backdrop to what was happening. We had a driver who was critically injured and sadly went on to lose his life. And so from a management point of view, we had enormous challenges. But if, you know, Formula One is a business, it's also a sport, but for an enormous number of people, it's a passion as well. And I'm sure a lot of people in this room have passion for their business and their sport. And I think we were very, very lucky to deal with a lot of people who desperately wanted to make sure that the team continued. And a lot of the, you know, getting, like most things, a team is only as good as the people in it. And the great thing for us is when the whisper kind of went out that the team was going to be restructured, the number of people who came back to work in the team was extremely high percentage, and that was a very good thing. And I think without that, actually, we would never have made it down to Melbourne for the start of this year.
Yeah, no, well done. Can I ask Paul, in terms of sponsorship? Now, Pirelli have been involved. We were talking earlier. 250 race series in 54 countries, both cars and bikes. Pirelli sponsors the teams. They're the sole and exclusive tyre supplier. And you also have a sponsorship arrangement and happy relationship with FOM, don't you?
Absolutely. We are involved globally in motorsport. There's very few companies that have such global motorsport presence, probably nobody in reality.
Yes.
I always say to people, you know, what do you think of Formula One? I said, well, look, the other 249 championships want to be Formula One. You know, they're all aiming and striving to be Formula One. It's a genuine global platform. It's probably the only world championship that I can think of that goes around the world, genuinely, every year. It's not something that happens every 4 years, it happens every single year. Next year, looking at 21 races, going to new territories as well. And, you know, it's from our point of view, for business, there's also international, multinational. It's a very unique platform that obviously uses a product that we make, but it's still very unique in its proposition.
Mm-hmm. What's unique about it in terms of the engagement with sponsors? We saw yesterday and this morning some fantastic presentations on what sponsors really are demanding That's probably the right word in terms of activation and measuring the return on that investment. How do you go about it?
Well, I mean, I've only seen some parts of the other presentations, and you know, we use companies like Repucom to analyse all of our presence. You know, we have different levels of representation. The first one, which is more visible, which is the trackside advertising, and that's really about brand recognition. So when we're going and trying to grow in territories where we've historically not been as strong, and Asia would be one of those, it was important to get our brand recognised. So we need the brand to be seen. And that's functioned extremely well, and that's something that we obviously monitor, and we're very pleased with that return on investment. Having said that, then for us there's different stories to be had, because we're also a technology supplier, you know, which is quite unique. We're not just a sponsor, but we're also a technical partner of the teams. So you have a different type of activity which is driving technology within the business. Now, we are a sole supplier, and people say, well, you know, maybe that doesn't push the technology. The reality is Formula One does. You know, it's a moving target. They don't stand still. You have 10 different teams all trying to find the limits. And you have to understand where they're going to find those limits, because we're the bit that's in touch with the ground. And you're always trying to make sure that those limits aren't impacting on your limits as well. So it's as a driver of technology, I mean, we've gained a lot from simulation data and simulators. Now, people probably don't know, but most F1 teams actually do a lot of their development in a virtual sense. They don't go on the track anymore. They actually have these great big simulators, big PlayStations if you want to simplify it, but very expensive ones. And we also have to create tyre models for those simulators that represent our tyre model. And we can go testing. You know, we can put in different tyre models, and they can evaluate them without actually going on the track. More and more, we're seeing that move towards the road car business. You will see the major car manufacturers in the next years will be developing virtually their vehicles because of, you know, speed, cost. The technology from F1 will fall down through. I mean, it already is with the McLaren road cars, for example, and Ferrari. But I think you'll see the mass manufacturers also working in that direction. And without Formula One, we may have taken, you know, that sort of move with a lot more difficulty. Okay, so essentially what you're saying is one of the KPIs that you are looking at is the application from what is currently going on track to increase sales with road cars, correct? Absolutely, and it's in certain markets working well. Yeah. It's starting to work well in Asia. Funnily enough, the US is interesting, which historically Formula One is trying to go. It's trying to create a market there. It's come and gone many, many times. But the understanding of the brand is very, very high, is what we're finding. So maybe if they're not following the races in the detail of some of the European countries, they know what Formula One is. And that's also a powerful message. Yeah.
Graeme, I must ask you a question about technology, the hybrid rules in Formula One. Mark Webber had some very strong comments, the former Red Bull driver, about the car's strengths being watered down. He's likening it to a rugby league tackle, less 30%, and the noise of the cars, and far too close to the other categories in motor racing. Do you agree with that? And if so, what would you like to see happen in the future?
I agree in part. You know, I don't think Formula One should simply be a test of strength of the drivers. In fact, a typical Formula One driver, if you see them, they're a strange creature. They don't need much upper body strength anymore, so small arms will do. Their legs are required only for pressing the throttle and ideally not pressing the brake very much. So from that point of view, you know, Formula One cars have changed immeasurably over the years. But I think where his comments actually, you know, really did resonate is we have to remember, and one of the previous panelists said it, you know, we are in the entertainment industry. Yes, it's a sport, but it's also entertainment. And in the last 2 years, we've seen the introduction of power units which are incredibly complex. And if you see beauty purely in engineering, they're incredibly beautiful. And they solve some amazing problems. The ladies and gentlemen who've designed these true works of art are incredibly good at their job. But the reality is that the end product hasn't really necessarily added to the entertainment. And you know, one of the things that we always used to ask guests that we looked after in the team, if they'd spent a weekend with us, whether it was at Monaco or Silverstone or here in Singapore, is, have you been to Formula One race before? Usually they hadn't, and we would say, you know, what's your lasting memory? And it was nearly always to do with the senses, the sort of sensory overload of being near these cars. You could feel the power; they're incredibly powerful.
And that's the key, Graeme, because for broadcasters, rights holders, sponsors, that's the key, that they want that impact.
Yeah.
Without giving too much away, because I know that you can't say a lot about this, but do you think we're going to see a shift back to the more traditional Formula One car?
Well, I think the important thing is that people recognise that all of these things all of these factors are important. You know, the wow factor is important, and you know, we've been able to showcase some incredible technology. You know, the Grand Prix that we race, you know, the Grand Prix here is the same distance that it was 2 years ago. 2 years ago, we used a normally aspirated V8 engine and 160, 165 kilograms of fuel to do the Grand Prix. And this weekend, we do exactly the same distance, and the regulation limits us to 100 kilograms of fuel. That's an enormous efficiency saving. But it's not really translated into, you know, an increase in sponsorship interest or whatever. So, you know, some of, I guess the message is there's some fabulous things happening, but some of them don't necessarily translate directly through or immediately through into, you know, creating a better economics for the participants. And at the end of the day, you know, the teams need to. Well, every participant within the sport needs to prosper and grow.
Just speaking of the economics, Paul, can I ask a question of you? Clearly we've had, over the years, we've had Bridgestone, we've had Michelin, Pirelli, sole and exclusive supplier, and Seb Vettel recently was speaking in glowing terms about you and how you helped him not win the race. How do you manage that, and what's the relationship between Pirelli, the teams, and the drivers?
Well, we helped him win 3 world championships, so it was a bit selective. But no, it's you take the rough with the smooth. You know, it's a sport that is full of emotions, and you have drivers in certain situations. You know, they're coming out of a hot situation. They say things. I mean, I'm sure even in soccer, if you actually spoke to somebody after they just missed a penalty and could have won the final of a championship, if you could get the camera in front of them 20 seconds after, you might get a reaction that not everybody would be pleased about. But you know, that's part of life. You know, if you speak to him, which we have done afterwards, you know, he'll say, "Look, oops, sorry," and heat of the moment. But that is Formula One, and that is why it has that passion. You know, it is man and machine at extreme speeds and extreme cornering. You know. People might not, well, Mark Webber, for example, is now racing in sports prototypes. Yeah. People might not know that, but around Spa, those cars are 5 and 6 seconds slower than a Formula One car, to give you an idea. Yet they have 200, 300 horsepower more, four-wheel drive, and big, wider tyres and more downforce. So that performance comes from somewhere in a Formula One car, and it's going around corners, you know, and it still is a very extreme form of motorsport. These cars are still extremely quick and getting quicker by the day. And as Graeme said, you know, if you take into account the fuel efficiencies, you know, if we'd stayed with the old fuel loads, I mean, we'd now be lapping, I dread to think what speeds we'd be lapping at, you know, it'd be phenomenal. So it still is an extreme sport, and, you know, as I say, we sometimes have to take the rough with the smooth from that point of view, but it comes by being in such a passionate and high adrenaline sport.
Yeah, just in terms of passion, David and I were talking earlier, and we saw the statistics about football viewership. You know, you've got 600 million, apparently there are 4.2 billion people around the world that watch the Premier League, depending on how that statistic is measured. Television audiences in Formula One have remained relatively static, 500 to 600 million. Why is that, and what more can be done in terms of engagement with fans? We heard a lot of people talk yesterday about really innovative ways using social media, using handheld devices. You know, the sorts of things that football are doing seems to be almost light years away from what is a technology industry, Formula One. So what would you like to see happen, Graeme?
Well, I've got 2 young children, and they don't, they sit in our living room. They're 8 and 13. My son's 8, my daughter's 13. They sit in the living room, but they don't watch the box in the corner. If Formula One's on, they're multi-screening, they're watching things, they're doing all sorts of stuff. An old dinosaur like me, looks at it with some marvel, because one of the great attributes of our sport is it's data rich. There are so many sources of data and information, and I think there's an enormous opportunity there for people to take that data and really articulate it in a way that people can understand it and be entertained by it and interact. And also, I think, take it a step further as well. I think as a sport we have something quite unique, which is we don't just have the ability to allow the fan base, and the fan base of Formula One is enormous. It's absolutely enormous. It's global, it's knowledgeable. We have the ability not just to entertain them, but to actually fully interact with them. Why not have them being part of the design process of Formula One's all about problem solving. Yeah. So these devices that they're using represent an enormous global computing power. Why don't we harness that? And we as a team could use it for running tyre simulations. We run thousands of simulations on a Saturday evening of the race, and I think we could engage with fans in not just a one-way relationship, but actually get them involved in being part of the team, and and feeling part of the team. And I just think there's an enormous opportunity there, and it's a one I'm sure will be grabbed in the years to come. Paul,
any comments?
Well, pretty similar to Graeme in terms of the way the world's going in terms of the digital world. I mean, I was in a meeting with Microsoft a few months ago, and one of their big concerns or discoveries over the last few years is that not only are people going and playing their games, which they like, they thought that was great, but people have now become professional gamers, and people are paying to watch gamers play a virtual game. So that for them was a bit of a shocker. Even for them, they found this tendency, and I was thinking, oh my God, so we're going to have a Formula One race where we sit in a room like this, and people pay to watch us have a Formula One race in a room. So maybe in our lifetimes that might well happen. Who knows? But it shows that people are changing their approach to their entertainment. I think soccer is tribal. It has a different appeal. I mean, I'm a Bristol City fan for my sins, and you couldn't pay me to go and watch Chelsea or Manchester United. I'd never go. Formula One doesn't have that tribal following. It's slightly different. And the automotive world is also a niche. Motorsport is a niche. So the comparisons sometimes with soccer are a little bit harder to do. But there's a lot of things I think that soccer has done. I mean, here in Asia, I was here in Singapore living for a few years, and the effect of the English Premier League on the local environment was phenomenal. They invested heavily, the Premier League, in bringing their sport here. And Formula One needs to do a bit more of that. We need to, outside of race weekends, we need to be promoting the sport year-round, not just when there's one race. Because that's the disadvantage. We have one race in Singapore, but for 11 months of the year, Singapore doesn't feel Formula One. And I think that's something that we need to learn from. We need to feed the drug, give people continuity of content. And that comes as well from the race calendar. It's tough having a 21 race next year. In reality, some people would say to me, you should really have 35 races, as NASCAR does, because people then get into the habit of every Sunday, bang, bang, bang. Maybe we have 2 race teams that travel the world in, there are ways of looking at the sport in a different way that that would shock Graeme, because he'd be thinking, oh my God, we need 2 Grahams though. We have to have a duplicate
You need to talk to my wife.
But unfortunately, a lot of the sports that have the greater popularity have that consistency of presence, and people like to have their fill of sort of the drug. And that's something that has certainly worked in NASCAR, although I would say that Formula One is a unique product, and it does travel the world, so it has a rather large logistical problem.
What about the expected departure of Renault as a engine manufacturer, developer in Formula One? 50 Grand Prix wins since 2008, I think 4 World Championships, so it's going to be a huge departure. They've said, Anthony, they're going to honour their agreements till the end of 2016, I believe. All this is media reports overnight. What impact will that have? Do you expect it to happen? And what's your feelings on the news?
Let's ask Graeme.
You know, I have absolutely no idea. It's like watching some strange kind of marital thing being played out in front of the world's television. You know, I don't know. It is important. Renault are an incredibly big brand, a very important brand, and they have a tremendous history with Formula One, so it's important from that point of view. They're also a key supplier into Formula One. You know, there are 4 engine suppliers currently in Formula One, or power unit suppliers in Formula One: Renault, Honda, Ferrari, and Mercedes. And there are 2 championships: a drivers' championship and a constructors' championship. So, from a team perspective, you know, we're in. You know, the #1 championship for any team is the constructors' championship. That's the holy grail of why we compete. And you know, we view Formula One as it's the greatest team sport in the world. But all sports have to have heroes, and the drivers are the heroes, and that's why we have a driver championship. We don't actually have a power unit championship at all, but the power units have become incredibly important and have a huge influence on these other 2 championships. So the most important thing from our point of view is that the marketplace for supply, if you like, the supply chain for that particular part of the mix is efficient and effective. That's really has to be the team's view. You know, it's not my job to try and run Renault or anything else like that, and you know, not that they would be that interested. The important thing from our point of view is we need to know that there is an efficient marketplace for what is a very, very key part of the mix for us. We don't make engines. You know, there's only 2 teams on the grid who do. It's pretty complex activity, and as I said before, you don't get it. You can't win a championship with it. So, I guess from our point of view, Renault have to do whatever's right for Renault. That's important. They have shareholders, and those shareholders will you know, deserve to be looked after correctly. So they'll do whatever's right for them. But hopefully, the important thing for us is that there is some efficiency and effectiveness in that part of the supply.
Can we ask the elephant in the room, which is politics? Politics in all sport, but politics in Formula One seems like, well, it's bigger than most. Now, the question that we have, because David and I were talking, in fact, yesterday on this topic, clearly Bernie Ecclestone has gone from the mechanic, if we believe the story, to somebody who has really dominated the sport in every sense, from sponsorship, of FOM. I remember the first time that we were acting on behalf of a broadcaster, believe it or not, there were only 13 GPs, so that was a very, very long time ago. 21, as Paul quite rightly said, next year. Clearly he's taken it from something which was predominantly European to global. Is there life after Bernie? And what does that look like?
Well, first thing, I don't think he ever touched a spanner. I need to put that one right. Or maybe a gold, made of gold or something. But certainly, I don't think
it's myths become legends.
I believe he arrived in Formula One already with a private plane, even 40 years ago. So, look, I mean, Bernie, as you quite rightly said, has created such a globally important sport. One day, he won't be there. And I think everyone asked that question, who would replace him? I think the answer is not one person can. There's nobody with the background of Bernie Ecclestone, 40 years in the sport, that has his connections, his understanding. So you're going to need a mix of people, I'm quite sure, from politicians who know governments. You know, to put on an F1 race, you need to have a lot of government support. Yep. You need people involved in television. You need people able to actually run the day-to-day intricacies of the sport. You know, working with the teams, with Graeme and the other teams and the federation. So it's going to take a number of people to actually replace him, and it won't be easy. That's for sure.
Do you have any comments?
Yeah, I think, you know, Bernie's world class at what he does. he's the CEO of the commercial rights holder, and I'm absolutely certain that the shareholders of that company are extremely pleased with the returns that that he's delivered. And I think that's probably one of the big misconceptions, is everybody thinks that Bernie's meant to work for them, and he doesn't. He works for a part of the business, which actually is the foundation of the whole business, and he does an incredible job. And as Paul said, he has that mix of all the different contacts and everything. So it's, he does it in quite a stylistic way. And I'm pretty sure when Bernie does decide to stop, the sun will still come up the next day, and there'll still be Formula One and all the rest of it. But it'll probably be a different sort of Formula One. But equally, I do think that Bernie comes in for a lot of flack, and some of it, I think, is because people think maybe he has some of his responsibilities actually lie outside of really what his key responsibilities are. Yeah,
no, I think that's fair. I guess a related question is that we discussed today on a panel financial fair play in football, and I know it's been mooted at the strategy committee in F1. Do you think we'll ever see a time where the equivalent of FFP will come into motorsport? And if not cost control, what would you like to see happen in terms of revenue? Is it increasing the revenue pie through greater commercialisation of rights, or is it greater distribution or more equitable distribution of the current prize money?
I think if you look at what we have at the moment, it's quite easy to criticise it. And also, we have seen certain companies within our industry have had difficulties, and that would suggest that maybe the structure of the industry could be more efficient and more effective, and I happen to think it probably could be. How we would reach that point, I think, would be a mixture of regulations, both technical and sporting, and perhaps financial as well. We have two rule books. We have a technical regulation book and a sporting regulation book. Perhaps there's a place for a third one which could limit some commercial aspects. But I think whereas financial fair play is a recipe that works in some sports, our sport's quite different. Our costs are not largely people-based. So the financial tools would be maybe slightly different. But there's a lot that could be done, and I think the acid test should be, ultimately, it should be skill that's rewarded and not financial strength. Otherwise, all we'd need to do is sit the accountants down at the start of the season. They'd all get their balance sheets out and say, right, who's got the most money? Okay, you win, there's the cup. And, I don't know about you, but I wouldn't watch that. So I think, something that rewards skill, whether it's through design, driving capability, teamwork in pit stops or whatever, but if that should be the acid test at the end of the day.
Paul?
Yeah, I think the next opportunity is probably going to be when the current commercial agreement with the teams expires, which is 2019, 2020. There's an opportunity there, I think, for the teams, but they have to work collectively. They have to look at a big picture of where the sport's going, and I think acting collectively for the long-term future of the sport, they can find a solution, because there's enough money. There's enough money in the sport.
That's a good point.
To make a very successful championship that does 20, 21, whatever races they want to do. But there is enough money available to create that sport. So they all need to step back, a little less self-interest, and look at the overall health of the sport. And in the end, I think you'll end up with more conversations about the racing and less about teams struggling or changing or going out of business.
Just in terms of the human aspects, obviously the sport sometimes is criticised as being elitist, it's too technologically driven, it's machine and not man. David and I are both Australian, so we love Daniel Ricciardo for all the right reasons. I don't know did anybody see Daniel on the Jeremy Clarkson program when he did the fastest lap, beat Lewis Hamilton? The fact that he is not trained by any PR agency and will not be, he just doesn't believe that. He jumped up on the couch and was just the most infectious, energetic, and he was childlike. He had a smile from ear to ear. You cannot make that up. So our question to you, because we're biased, is given the drivers that you've interacted with, who was the one that's perhaps inspired you the most and why? So I'll ask Paul first, and then Graeme, I'll ask you second.
Well, there's a huge number over the years, to be honest, and there are different characters, but we do need to see more of what you just described. You know, that huge infectious smile of Danny, you know, he's obviously winning races last year, was very, very good for the sport and was picked up by a lot of fans that they want to see more of that. But, you know, you've got people like Lewis. You know, I'm in LA quite a lot, and I've been on flights getting in, he's on chat shows, and people in LA, I don't think know he's a Formula One driver, they just know him as Lewis Hamilton. But, you know, we need more people in our sport that get out there, because when they're working, they've got a helmet on, you can't see their face. So we have to make sure that they're human beings, they have a personality, and then people can actually relate to that. So Lewis and Danny currently are two people that do convey something a bit different. So I think we do need as a sport to get the character out of the drivers a little bit more.
I'm obviously obliged to say that anyone who's driven for our team is quite clearly worth looking at. But historically we've always run junior teams as well, and we've had a lot of guys who are on the grid at the moment in Formula One have driven for Manor in the junior teams. And I would say the two that really come to mind are Lewis Hamilton, who drove for Manor in Formula Renault and Formula 3, and Kimi Räikkönen, who we won the championship with in Formula Renault, and for two completely opposite reasons. But in both cases, they're characters, very, very different characters. You know, Lewis is, you know, just from the minute you first saw him in a Formula Renault car, you just knew that he was, you know, not going to rest until he's winning championships. And Kimi's the absolute opposite. You know, you almost had to be woken up and put in the car, and off he went. But phenomenal.
That's because it was heavy night drinking, and you know that, Graeme.
I wouldn't possibly comment. You know, but phenomenal talents in the car, and their characters, and you know, that's what sports people should be. You know, gone are the days where they could do all of this anonymously. You know, the more characters that we have, the better.
On the records, because he could draw level with his great hero Ayrton Senna with 41 career wins, which is a huge milestone. I think everybody in the room would be interested to know about whether you compare him in that league. I know we lost Senna far too early, but what is it about him as a driver?
I think it's always difficult to compare drivers from era to era, because the task that they have and the challenges and the pressures are very different. You know, so I think it's really difficult to draw a direct comparison. But you know, I personally would be absolutely delighted. I mean, absolutely delighted if Lewis goes on and continues to break more records. He's world class at what he does, and he deserves all the success that he gets. He's completely committed to his sport, and I didn't know Ayrton Senna. I did watch him race. You know, I remember watching that race at Donington, and I've never seen a first lap of a Grand Prix like that before. He's, you know, clearly completely in control of what he's doing. And so, you know, similar characters in terms of their, you know, just absolute devotion to winning, really. And you know, I think, as I said, Lewis deserves all the success that he gets, because he's completely and utterly, you know, completely devoted to the job in hand.
Paul?
Well, you know, I'm a Brit, so Lewis will always be be up there. I think I agree with Graeme. It's difficult to compare eras, and if you see, there's a BBC film about the terrible years in the 50s and 60s of Formula One, and you know, I'm not sure many current Formula One drivers would have had the bravery that those people did when, you know, drivers' lives were being lost almost every weekend. You know, so the sport moves on, and different skills are needed. But what I always say to people is that the top guys really are the top. You know, there's no doubt that the Alonsos, Hamiltons, you know, Vettels are exceptional talents, and you actually see it here actually in Singapore. I mean, I tell people, don't just look at the one lap, look at those top boys and look at their consistency over a race distance here, which, you know, it's a long race, it's hot, you know, you've got walls either side of you. Yeah. You look at the top guys and compare them with their teammates, and you then see some phenomenal performances, and it is ultimately that consistency. It's not just about the one lap, it's about doing it all the way through the race, not making errors. You know, one error you spin and then, you know, you've lost your race, but these top boys are really exceptional.
A question for everybody, including you, Anthony, about if there was one thing in Formula One you would like to see progress to sell the sport better, what would it be?
I'll go first. I've got a 19-year-old, well, he will be 19 in November. We've just dropped him off at Exeter University. He's an omni-channel generation. Everything he does is on his handheld device. I would love to him to feel as excited and as passionate about sport, but in particular Formula One, as me. So I'd like to see the sport taken into the digital age sooner rather than later.
I agree. It's exactly the answer I would give. You know, I think what everybody wants to see, certainly us from the team point of view, is growth. And so you have to say to yourself, where's that growth going to come from? And I think it's embracing new technology and as I said before, involving people, not just in a one-way conversation with the fans, but you know, the biggest asset that we have in Formula One is the fan base, and it's enormous and it's super valuable. And we shouldn't just protect it. We should protect it and grow it. And I think we can adopt technology and really use that to make the next big growth step forward.
I think I'd focus on the drivers. I'd like to see a driver from Asia on the podium one day in Formula One. And I'm excluding Australia, by the way. I'm sorry about that, guys, but you've had your fair share.
I will forgive you.
But yeah, you know, I mean, we need to have a Chinese and also an Indian driver, you know, on the top step in Formula One.
He's such an interesting character. Last question, but what is Bernie Ecclestone like in a high-powered meeting?
For me, it's an education. You know, some of his techniques are extremely impressive, and I write it all down because it's a great opportunity to learn.
I think I'm glad he never got into the oil business or the arms business, because he'd be by far and away the richest man in the world.
No, he is the best poker player of anybody I have ever seen. I'm 52 years of age, so I started practicing in '84. And he's very disarming. He's diminutive, but he is incredibly powerful, and I mean that in every sense. I mean, power comes from restraint, and he's very restrained. But he also has a very softly spoken voice, so he will come into a room and he'll say, "Nice to see you, Anthony, I'm not sure I can help you." And to go into a room where he will always come into that room, you'll have to be there waiting for him. So you know, sweat on your brow and you're wondering what's going to happen. But it's, as Graeme said, he's quite extraordinary, and he has been, you know, the reason, single-handedly, the reason why the sport is where it's at. We hope, as we said, we can take it to the next level.
Thanks, Anthony, Graeme, Paul. Thanks for your insights. We know you've got to get to a meeting very soon.
Well done, guys. Thanks very much.
Fantastic you're heading on.